conditionality to check how that is correlated with the variation between 2023 and 2021. And then we will plan how we can help states and municipal governments to actually induce systematic changes when they can see this broader context of how to achieve racial, reducing the racial inequality gaps. So basically that's it. Thank you very much.
I think it's a fascinating study, and I think the data that you collect in a structured way from representative samples across Brazil should really give some insightful evidence about what really drives these gaps and what can be done about them. And some of it's very subtle. I'm involved in a research project in Rio now where part of it, and it's called teacher mindsets. And part of it is, analyzing teachers' expectations of their students. And the gap in expectations for white and Black and brown students is really very stark. So there's subtle things that will have to be part of the picture in this work, as well as structural things like laws and resource change, shifts in resources. Next, let's go to the technology half of the panel with Wahedur, talking about the cost effectiveness of using mobile phones to assess student learning compared with in-person testing.
Thank you. Hello everyone. So we are going to switch the gear a little bit now. The presentation is on whether how we know, whether does it matter how we know how much students learn or how much students know? And the short answer is yes, it matters. So done presentation? Okay. So over during the pandemic, the use of phone service have rapidly rise. I have done it myself. I'm pretty sure most people here who does service have done it. And it is also true for measuring learning. And there has been concern about how much students are losing in terms of learning during the pandemic. So for instance, this study takes place in Bangladesh, which has experienced one of the longest school closure during the pandemic, 18 months. And now we are knowing that students suffered a lot. I mean, in different aspects, but also in learning. But during that, phone-based assessments became much more popular than before, and several studies have utilized phone-based testing. For instance, we saw the paper that Claire presented yesterday. And we know from the literature that survey modes matter in terms of individuals' responses. And measuring learning using phone survey, that can affect how much we are measuring, because who is responding, often we cannot control it. Family members surrounding can help, MVNs can influence. The students, the child's familiarity with technology can influence their responses. So there are different factors that can go on. So in this paper, the question that we essentially ask is whether phone-based assessments are comparable with in-person assessment, and if not, and how much difference there is. So we explored this comparability, and to that we administered the same test on the same child twice, once in person and once over the phone. And these are all 5 to 18-year-old children. I mean, 18-year-old could be in a university, but we just wanted to cover bases for different reasons. We did the ASER test, so the Bangladeshi adoption of ASER. And then we also added some additional questions for children who would have, higher proficiency. And we used the Crawford et al. Paper that where they also did phone-based testing and also added some questions about. This paper, in essence, is similar to two other papers. One is already published in the Education Economics Review, where the authors did this comparison, but using existing assessment, and then the other paper, which does RCT, which does essentially similar to what we are doing, but we have different findings. So the summary of result, as I said at the beginning, learning level measured through phone assessment differs significantly from in-person tests. Children score significantly more over phone tests, and they also take less time. I guess no surprise, but that's what we find. And the deviation is similar by gender, while it's more for younger children. And also more for, as I will see, more for children who have lower learning level in the in-person test. So the study design, let me take a bit of time what we are doing here. So we have this about more than 1,000 households from this other survey we did right around the school opening. We call this the back to school survey to measure which school students are going back to school or dropping out or re-enrolling, that phenomena. From there, we randomized essentially order of survey. So we split the sample half and half, or almost half and half. So what we call treatment here for ease of communication, we are doing the phone survey first, and the other group we are doing the phone survey later, right? So for the phone survey first, we are starting with the phone survey, then we wait for a week or two, and then we do the in-person survey. For the phone survey latter group, we do the flip. We start with the in-person survey, then again wait for a week or two, and then do the phone survey. So that's essentially the study design, and we do this orderings to ensure that it's not because of which test you are getting first or not. And in administering the survey itself, we know that ASAR questions have increasing level of difficulty. So we start with the second from bottom proficiency for each child, and then if they are proficient in that level, they get increasingly difficult questions. If they don't get that level, they go to the proficiency level below that. And the additional questions that we have are not offered to children who are at the level below of the first question that they got, and I'll tell that a little bit more in the following slide. But so essentially we are starting here, which is for Bangla, it is the Bangla is the native language for Bangladeshis, for 99% of Bangladeshis. A child is tested at the word level. Then if they fail that level, they go to the letter level. If they fail that level, they do not have any foundational literacy in Bangla. If they pass that level, they have minimal foundational literacy in Bangla. And then again, if the child passes the word level, they get paragraph. If they fail paragraph, then we say, okay, they know word and spelling. If they pass paragraph, they get story. And then based on whether they pass or fail, we again give them. So that's one level of, that's measuring proficiency. But we are, in doing so, we are also measuring whether they are getting each question right or wrong. And based on that, we also construct the test score that I'll show you. So that's the ASAR. And any child who passed this level, irrespective of whether they pass the following, get the bonus questions. So that's how we have administered the test. Now, to make this test comparable, some of the ASAR questions require visual cues. So for the in-person, it's pretty simple. We gave the enumerators the visual cues, and they took it on a piece of paper, went to the child, they saw it, and they responded. Or so there are visual cues. But how do we do that for the phone test? So we texted the questions to the children. So for that, what it means in the sample universe, we had to ensure that each child had access to either able to open a text message in the phone handset that they're talking to, or using to talk, or they had a different phone where they could get a text message. Without that, we cannot. So our analysis, we keep children only if this condition was met. And that's how we are ensuring that we can deliver the visual cues for the ASA test to the children. We train the enumerators in a way so that the child was asked a question once they verbally confirm that they're ready to answer. So to do that, we ask the child whether they can open and read the text message. Once the child confirms that they have received the text message after we have sent it, the test begins. And as I said, there is no visual cues for the bonus questions. So essentially, this is for the visual questions, the bonus questions, the difference is whether you can respond hearing over the phone or respond when I'm asking you the questions in person. So in the both survey, we have constrained it by time. Each question had a 4-minute time limit, except for one question in Bangla. And we informed the child about the time limit before every question. And we estimate this regression where Y is test score or proficiency level or time. Phone is whether the test is phone, and this is delta is a child level fixed effect that would absorb as well the ordering, right? And we cluster by household. The sample is comparable whether you do phone first or phone later. We have about just about 50% female or girls, and most are enrolled in school. Now, this graph is showing whether the test scores are correlated to each other. What this is telling us, yes, across the 3 subjects we test and overall score, the phone test and in-person test are correlated to each other. However, test scores differ by test type. So as you can see here, on the phone test, students are scoring more for each score. And then when we do the regression, we see about, so this is standardized with respect to in-person test. Is 0.14 standard deviation more in the overall, in the phone test, which is above the median that we kind of debated about yesterday. And it differs by subject. And this is, the other thing is this phone test takes less time. So this is by minutes, and the overall test average in-person time was 26 minutes. For the phone test, it took about 16 or 17 minutes on average. So it's about 10 minutes less for the phone test. And this difference is higher for children with lower learning level. So as you can see, like if they would have scored same, this would be in this 45-degree line, but we can see for the lower level learning, the gap is more, while it's less for higher level. And also, it's not, we don't have many in the in this distribution. This is quite high, right? So for -2 standard deviation in person, we see almost -1.2 standard deviation over the phone. So that's like 0.8. So for one data point, I'm just showing. This is also translated into the proficiency levels. Like in phone test, we find higher proficiency for students who actually have lower proficiency in the in-person test. And when we see whether proficiency increases or decreases or remain the same, for Bangla, like almost two-thirds, it remains the same. And like for the rest, like half and half, whether it increases or decreases. But for the other 2 subjects, we see that for a significantly higher portion than Bangla, and significantly higher portion, then whether it remains, it decreases, it increases. Yes, thank you. I'm just wrapping up. And then we look at like where this change is happening, and it also differs by subject. So for Bangla, it happened. So for the word level, so the second level proficiency, we see the largest increase from phone survey to in-person survey, from in-person survey to phone survey. And for English, also it happens for the second level, which is in the first level, which is letter, where you see the increase from in-person survey to phone survey. But for math, the biggest jump is in the highest level, which is the division level proficiency, where the increase is from in-person to phone survey is about 13 percentage points. We do not see any difference in the gap by gender except for math. I realized that we didn't add the only female mean here, which I should have had. And however, we do see that the gap is less for, the gap is larger for younger children. So essentially, as age increases, the gap decreases. So means for the younger children. And that takes me to the concluding slide, which is we assume that in-person tests are the benchmarks, I mean, just for the sake of comparison. And if so, phone tests are prone to overestimate learning levels. And that has consequence in using phone tests to measure learning level. And we probably should adjust our measurements if we want to compare with in-person tests. Thank you. I give you 13 seconds.
Great, thank you very much. And next we'll hear from Andy through video connection. Are you there, Andy?
I'm here, thanks so much. And thanks to the organizers. Very happy to be presenting again at Rice. My paper is entitled Explaining the Productivity Paradox. What I'm really looking at is what happens when teachers are asked to use technology in their classroom. And I think this even speaks to a wider question about what happens when workers more broadly are exposed to new technology. This paper is now out actually as a working paper with the Edinburgh working paper series. So please take a look and distribute freely. It's out there. It's been great fun. And I want to thank them for putting it out there. I usually start with my presentations with the very last slide, because I think the very last slide is the most important one. I really want to thank here Avanti Fellows, the NGO that I've been working with for more than 5 years now, that really have embraced the findings also, and the government of Haryana. All of the study is in Haryana in government secondary school. So huge thanks to all the partners and also funders for that study. I want to start out with something very old, and that's the productivity paradox. And I would argue that this paradox where Solo said, you can see the computer age everywhere, but in the productivity statistics, is still around, right? So this just goes back to the 80s where computers were a new thing and people were saying like, wow, this is this cool new thing. This is a computer. And then Solo noticed that, well, computers are actually everywhere, but they're not showing up in the productivity statistics, right? Now you could say, hey, I mean, why are you showing me stuff from the 80s? Isn't this like a bit outdated? But what's happening right now is exactly that. That people are again super excited about technology, right? You hear it everywhere. Everything is buzzing about AI and cool new toys and whatnot. And this stuff is thrown at workers and also thrown at teachers. And the foremost researcher in AI in the AI space from formerly MIT, now at Stanford, say, we just see a redux of this productivity paradox. We see transformative new technologies everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. And I would argue really that why that is, or why we see like this mix of like effects is partly a function of why it is so hard to just study this. And I use EdTech really as an example for that to just show you that this is really always a weird intervention that's really hard to study. So you really don't know whether in most of the studies whether technology really serves the purpose of factor augmenting or complementary technology. So the intervention itself actually does that, or whether, for example, is increasing instructional inputs, right, or instructional time, right, such as in the studies by, the AER study by more later in et al. About the MindSpark study. These kids studied more, right? So maybe this is just an increase in inputs, right? Or maybe you're substituting inputs, right? Like you're saying to use some tech intervention, but you're taking something else away, right? Or you're placing the curriculum. Or what I would say, most of the time, you actually have a mix of everything. Like you have this mixed bag of you're asking students to do something extra, maybe you're asking teachers to do something else extra, and so forth. So I think EdTech is really a prime example of having all these things happening at the same time. And then sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down, and you really don't know what your intervention did, right? So what I want to do here is kind of solve this a little bit and look at a technology intervention that asks teachers to blend their instruction with technology. So you're not replacing anything, you're really asking teachers to co-teach with a technology, right? From what I know, this is the largest cluster randomized trial of an EdTech intervention that complements teaching, largely shutting down all these other channels that I just talked about. It compares the intervention also against a non-tech intervention. And it is a very large trial in partnership with the state government across 240 schools, 25,000 students in a single cohort, and with very rich data, not just in the outcomes, but also with classroom observation, teacher interviews, and student interviews. Right? Punchline is, after about a year of the intervention, this was pre-COVID, I find negative effects of the EdTech intervention on math. So this is in secondary schools, grades 9 and 10. No effects on science. No effects on of the non-tech intervention. So running this whole intervention with workbooks only, not with tech, but really standing out for me, this negative effects in math, not just on test scores, but also negative effects in terms of instruction, and also negative effects of student attitudes. So really consistent with what economists would call like an adjustment cost, so that you're asking somebody to use a new technology and take some adjustment, and in the short run, cynically or like ironically, when people talk about EdTech being disruptive, yes, this was very disruptive, and purely disruptive in terms of the negative effects. Right. Just to tell you a little bit about the context, so this is Northern India, state of Haryana, highlighting here the 8 districts where this program runs. The study had 240 schools. Again, so there's the main treatment consists of these 2 components. One is the technology intervention, where teachers are being asked to co-teach with these materials in the classroom. These are short snippets, so that it's not like the teacher is switching on some video, but the teacher is teaching what the teacher is normally teaching. And along with the normal curriculum, there's no changes to the curriculum. The teacher now teaches the same material with these short video snippets. Right. The second component is workbooks and school visits and a bit of coaching to teachers. But then I'm going to tease out these 2 components. In terms of the research design, I'm showing here the same location, and I have this 3-group cluster randomized trial with 80, 80, and 80. So one group gets RCT and gets ICT, so the technology intervention, together with school visits and the print materials, and there's a second group that gets just the workbooks and the print materials and the school visits, and then I have a pure control group. Main outcomes are written assessments that I assign myself, and then I have I break these down by subdomains in terms of content domains or cognitive domains as well. I have very rich data on implementation fidelity. I have very rich data on intermediate outcomes. I have monthly visits to these schools, so a very long timeline in terms of what's going on in these schools. Yeah, I think it's really rich in terms of what we see here. It's really trying to break up that black box that often, if you just look at test scores, you would never get at. Right? No magic happening here. This is a very simple cluster randomized trial. I want to point out one thing here. Certainly, the identification comes from the assignment of the treatment, or the 2 treatment groups. Here, this control variable, I'm actually able to match the study schools to the universe of the schools in India with dice. I also have the locations of the schools, and I have census tract data, so I can actually drop these schools into census information, and then through Shrug, I can actually connect all of that to all the information that we have about the villages that these schools are placed in. So this means that I have basically everything that you know about the villages where these schools are, from like the census to nightlight data is anything that you could possibly have. And then I run like a very simple lasso regression to pick out from that. So it's super rich background information that I'm using just as controls. Right? That also allows me then to compare the sample against just like other schools in India. Again, like EdTech interventions are often, very selective. In this case, also, they're a little bit positively selected, the schools where this program runs, but actually I can show that that the overall sample in comparison to India overall is quite representative. So on average, these schools actually look quite similar to the average Indian government school in terms of observable characteristics. In terms of internal validity, everything checks out. There's a slight imbalance between the workbook group and the control group. I run a bunch of robustness check to see whether that affects. If anything, it doesn't. As you can think, as an RCT, I'm the one assigning the random treatment. On top of that, also, this is not the main comparison of interest. The main comparison of interest is ICT versus control. Finally, in terms of internal validity, this stuff was used. So this is not a matter of implementation fidelity. I can show you all kinds of implementation and take-up data. I think my favorite one is where I use the timestamps of when Avanti Fellows, the NGO, visited these schools, and I link that to the backend usage data from the videos that they use in the classroom. And I can then compare whether they're actually playing the videos just when somebody comes and looks at them, or whether they also play the videos when there's nobody around, and they do. Right? So this is, for me, the best example to just show, like, hey, this is a teacher using these videos when nobody's around and just using these snippets and liking this, right? And more qualitatively, if you spoke to teachers, government officials, everybody was like, yes, this is a great intervention. This is really great. Let's use this, right? Now to the effects that I summarized at the beginning. In this graph, I'm showing you control group growth on the left-hand side. So how much did kids learn in the absence of anything? Top is math. So you see about a 30% of a standard deviation growth over the course of about a school year. In science, there's not much growth. So you could argue that there's not much productivity to begin with. And then on the right-hand side, the black bar shows you the ICT versus control comparison. So this is about the 16% standard deviation negative effect on test scores. Or if you compare it to the control group growth, it's about you're basically slashing the productivity in math by half. You cannot perfectly distinguish this. So it's not entirely driven by just a tech intervention. So you could say just doing something is already hurting a little bit. Maybe part of that is driven by just doing something without tech. But I think what stands out here is that, at least for math, where there was some productivity, you slash that productivity by half. Now, I'm not going to go through like all the pre-analysis plan checks that I also ran. Basically, there's not a lot going on in terms of heterogeneous effects or like effects by content domain or cognitive domains or stronger students or weaker students. So I'm going to skip a lot of that. I think what's much more interesting is that I can show that this is also negatively affecting the quality of instructions that the students receive. So these are various dimensions here that I aggregate to an index. What I'm showing you here is observations done by the NGO themselves. I then also do video-based re-ratings from a neutral team that is office-based, that is done by JPAL, not by the NGO. So this half a standard deviation negative effect on the instruction is measured by the NGO. When you adjust this for the bias that creeps in by the NGO doing that themselves, the negative effect that you get if you were to use the office-based neutral ratings is about a standard deviation negative effect. So huge negative effects, right? So you can pick whichever you want. Maybe this one is biased or because the NGO gives better ratings. In this case, though, then it is still almost a half a standard deviation negative effect in terms of instructional quality. And in terms of student perception,
3 minutes.
In terms of student attitudes, both interventions actually had a negative effect on student attitudes in terms of like how do students feel about math and science. Are students, for example, nervous about math, or do they feel happy and enjoy their learning about math and science? And actually, in both of these interventions, I had these negative effects. So in conclusion, negative effects on instructional quality, student attitudes, negative to null effects on student learning in math, where there was some productivity, that net productivity was slashed by half. And really just suggests that introducing these new technologies, at least in the short run, comes with some disruption, comes with some substantial adjustment costs, and this might not entirely be driven by the technology part. Again, some of this could have been driven just by doing something and asking people to do something different. They could be explaining part of the story. So it's going to be interesting to see whether then in the long run, that adjustment pays off. And actually, that's exactly what I'm working on right now. So this is pre-COVID and after COVID, with great funding from USAID. There's a new 2-year cohort where I'm currently working on the end line. But for me, really, there's this warning sign here that there's a lot of excitement now post-COVID. People say like, "Oh, we used EdTech, let's keep using that." Maybe I think there's positive examples that we've seen through RISE and some of our colleagues, but certainly be very careful how it's being used, what it is doing, what it's replacing. In this case, we really see these, at least in the short run, negative effects. Right. I want to highlight here I have a minute and a half left. I want to highlight one piece that's super important to me here. Avanti Fellows, the NGO here, has embraced these findings, and this is for me one of the best examples that I've seen ever about how somebody or how an organization reacts to findings. In math, Avanti has actually pulled the reacted to the negative effects and has pulled the entire intervention out of the classrooms and has pivoted to a new model where the NGO is now providing after school intervention through remote teaching. And in science, there was no negative effect, and they decided that we want to try to tweak this and get this working. Right? And really, to have a partner that doesn't try to make findings go away, but engages with the infrastructure, engages with the data, sees how to pivot and come up with a new intervention, and is now with me in the new period of the new cohort in the new RCT and studying that. And we're now currently launching our end line of that new 2-year period. For me, it's amazing. So a huge respect to them and huge thanks also to the funders who said like, yes, this is a negative finding, but let's keep going, let's pivot and see what we can learn in the future. So really great collaboration, and super happy and super excited about the findings that we have now coming in with the new cohort. All right, thanks so much.
Thank you, Andy, not just for your presentation, but for presenting. We talked yesterday about implementation, but for presenting a gold standard example of how to do an evaluation that really gives deep attention to all aspects of implementation. Can everyone come up here? I think that one of the biggest challenges for all education systems is to find ways to analyze the needs of disadvantaged populations and make sure that they get the support they need. And that could be not only gender gaps that we've heard about, or racial gaps, could be also be ethnic gaps. It could be, difficulties for students with disabilities. And, as we heard yesterday, differences in the mental health status of different groups of students. So I think there's a big agenda for countries to really analyze these issues and work on, really effective ways of addressing them. Questions? Lots, I see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Number one up here.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for the great presentations. My question's for Andy. I was wondering, one thing I didn't quite get from your study was the specific problem that videos were attempting to address in terms of either teacher practice or learning outcomes. And I think as we think about sort of video, I think your illustration is great in the sense that it might be disruptive in a negative sense. But I think a video maybe is primarily adding value in terms of solving a specific problem. So for example, illustrating particular concepts or supporting teachers with skill sets that they might struggle with in the classroom. So I was wondering sort of like, what was the original theory in terms of how video was going to support teachers, and how did you connect that to some of the baseline data you were seeing? Thank you, everybody.
Let's take 2 more, and please note whether your question is aligned with the question we just heard or not.
I have a question and a suggestion for Wahedur. The suggestion is see whether the effects of the phones depend on the education of the parents or the presence of an older sibling in the household who may be helping the kid. And the question is, has anyone checked whether the phone, the difference between the two biases estimates of the impact of a study. I mean, maybe if it's like an additive effect, it would cancel out, if you had used the phone. So maybe it's not a big problem. I don't know if you or anyone else has checked that.
Number 3 here, yeah. Thank you.
So my question is actually quite similar to Paul's for Wahedur. So you ended by saying phone tests are, in-person tests are the benchmark and are reliable, and phone tests overestimate learning, right? This actually raised a different question to me, is about how reliable these measures are in general, right? And we're sort of trying to get at some latent understanding of learning, and have just assumed that this gets us at it. And I was wondering if you had some sort of measure that could tell us either how reliable these were as measures of learning, and if you had the ways to parse potential reasons for the difference between phone and in-person, right? There's the assumption that people might be cheating, getting help, but there are a ton of other things that could be going on. So I just wanted to know if you had ways of parsing what could be going on.
You want to start with Andy responding to the first question? Did you hear the first question?
I heard the question, yeah. So the assumption was that this could help improve instructional quality. I think the theory is a bit different for science versus math, and also how the videos were structured. So in science, you saw them more as an introductory way to make a topic more interesting. So with a snippet of, let's say, an animation. For math, it was more about explaining a hard to understand concepts. But in both, I think, while these are two different aspects, the theory was, this would help the teacher improve their instructional quality in a short sense.
Wahed?
Yeah, thanks for Paul for the suggestion. We do have data on parents' mother's education, and we can actually see if the child is if the older child, if there are multiple children in the household. So we can actually test that. We didn't do this as part of an intervention, so we cannot really do that. I don't know if anyone else is doing both these in an intervention setting, but we have thought about it. In a future study potentially, just to check the point that you made. And for the other question, I just wanted to clarify that I didn't say it's reliable. I said if it is the benchmark, and I agree with you because that while ASAR has been used in multiple settings, and one could argue whether it is a reliable measurement of certain aspects of learning. It is still used quite widely to measure basic numeracy and literacy proficiency. So for that, probably it is. But however, this is what we are presenting is not to say that, hey, phone in person is the most reliable, and hence phone surveys are that much bad. It is, if we are going with the current understanding of how we are measuring it, which is dominantly in person, then compared to that, how much the phone measures are deviating. That's what we are presenting. We are not making the normative judgment that phone. Pardon me?
He did call it benchmark.
I said we assume that it's the benchmark. You have to compare with something. So that's what we are comparing with, which is still the widely used measure.
Here, please, Julius. And then you in front, sorry, and then 3 in the very back. Lindsay.
Thank you. Wahed again. So I've been involved with WESO citizen-led assessments in East Africa, so I'm a little bit familiar. So I'm following up on some detail you mentioned, the 4 minutes that you give the child. So I want to understand your thinking behind this. So my worry is, from my experience, children actually will show that they are competent on the question you're asking within or less than 4 minutes. But once you mention it, are you not introducing high stakes in this? And what's the thinking about this? And won't that stop the child from thinking properly and unnecessary? Thanks.
And this gentleman here, please.
This one is for Laura. A question and probably a suggestion just in terms of where it could lead to. Question is more on, let's say, the 5-pillar approach that you have. I think, because a lot of people and a lot of countries are measuring inequality. In fact, that's where the suggestion would come, that for many years now, we've been trying to have this, the differences in scores between boys and girls, and let's say even what you call as racial, let's say the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe and all of that, that is being measured and states are being ranked at an overall rank. So equity is feeding into how states are being looked for. So in a sense, you're making equity or, trying high stakes that states achieve and try towards it. But what necessarily should they do about it, which is where I was quite interested in what you're trying to do. That isn't always very clear. So would like to know more about that, Laura.
Laura?
I was taking notes. So just to clarify, you want to understand what Brazil can do about it by knowing what are where in the pillars the states and municipalities are at, right? Is that it?
Yeah, I mean, is it really helping them to do something?
Yeah, okay.
Curriculum and the 5. Any one or two examples you can share, because I said measuring not necessarily leads to action. Reporting inequality.
Yeah, of course.
If you've seen early signs of actively working on the curriculum or other aspects that you said.
Yeah, we are going to use this tool in some programs that we support at the Lemann Foundation, and aiming to actively reduce these gaps. So basically, this tool will help us to map where in each of the pillars the departments and municipalities are, to actually actively make a plan on where and how they could go through reducing these racial gaps. So that's very practical issue that we're tackling here. We're not focused on only collecting data for data itself, because we have a lot of data, as I showed before, from the national system showing the inequalities. But what we actually want to do here is map what actually governments and the departments can do. So we found these 5 pillars. Actually, we were based in Educação Já also to, I'm looking there because we have someone from Todos pela Educação, documents to understand what were the main pillars that we should focus on. And that's why this is developed to actually act and not only collect data, and then we can plan ahead on how to tackle these issues.
Lindsay?
I think I had.
Oh, sorry.
So
Sorry.
thanks for that question. That's an excellent point. So we did a pilot before doing this, and we played around with, whether we provide text message or not. And also there we played around with the timing issue. So we realized that, over the phone often, if there is, so in person, enumerators often have self-imposed different time constraint than over the phone. And that would create bias in our estimates that would not be comparable. So that's why we have to impose the time constraint. I agree, it can create the high stake situation that you mentioned. However, it would create for both in person and over the phone, because we impose time constraint in both. But I completely agree that it can have a slightly different, we have to do it by this time, psychological impact.
Lindsay? Sorry. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, a question to Wahedur again. Seems like it's a very popular presentation. So mine is a very technical question, and maybe if you want to, we can take it later. You used IRT to be able to sort of create a composite scale score, but then the items that you're using, the ASER items, they are inherently a little bit different from your regular dichotomous or even polytomous items, so to speak. plus these are time tests. So I was wondering whether is this question of whether IIT can even be utilized in this scenario a settled question, because there are certain fundamental aspects of assumptions that you have to make, like local independence and monotonicity and unidimensionality, that need to be satisfied on these items to be able to combine them in this manner. So have you looked at that, and is there more research which has sort of also utilized IIT in this context?
Hi, this question is for Andy. I think we've seen a lot of ed tech interventions go to scale. I was in the Bay Area during the MOOC explosion, where people were really excited about that, and then we saw mostly negative results for large scale studies. We have a lot of information now from COVID, and I guess I'm wondering why we assume this is a short-term adjustment and not, in tech terms, a feature and not a bug of ed tech interventions, detracting from a lot of what we know about learning theory that happens. The learning happens in the conversation and the application in ways that tech may actually detract from.
Anyone want to add something on that topic for Andy?
So related to that topic, I think it's really interesting that a lot of the findings of these four are really counterintuitive to what most funders invest in. Like, there's such a hype around investing in ed tech, investing in girls' education. And so I wonder how you think about, I mean, I guess there are funders in this room right now, so that's one way to reach them. But what do you think are other ways to get your findings in the hands of, to influence the way that funders invest, and particularly, the big ones like development agencies and the World Bank and these institutions that have a huge influence on where investments go? Because honestly, I feel like they're not hearing these kinds of findings right now. There's just this assumption that in policymakers as well, I guess. So how do you think we actually can reach policymakers and funders with your findings? And then also specifically for Victoria, I think your findings are really important, considering just a larger wave of, even in my country, the US, now we have more women going to higher education, becoming doctors. There's more women generally going higher in education than men. And so I wonder what you think are what do we actually need to be then investing in for boys specifically? Like what do we actually need to be doing then to counteract this sort of wave of investment in girls' education to create better outcomes for both?
In response to the first part, how to get to policymakers, maybe phone survey.
Very good advice too.
Chris, did you want to ask some?
My question is for Laura and Victoria. There are a lot of factors that put kids at risk: gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, etc. What's your sense of where you could intervene most effectively to create a culture where teachers believe all kids can succeed and give them the tools to help them do that? Is it at the system level? Is it the teacher training level? What's your intuition on the first steps that should be taken to create that culture?
Let's take those questions. How to get to policymakers, how do you really solve the problem of inequality in education? And how do you get to policy? And you had the second part of your question too.
What do we need to do to impact boys?
Yeah.
I think for policymakers, so maybe I'll speak to the Kenyan context. I think this was early this year. The Ministry of Education was revising its education and gender sector training policy, so it's a long name. And one of the things that we do at IPA is by presenting evidence synthesis that could inform the revision or formulation of new policies, for example. So it was quite interesting and encouraging to hear from policymakers that most of the evidence is just focusing on girls, and they wanted to see more evidence on boys and the disadvantages that they face in school. So I think one of the key things to do more intentionally as an organization or as a group that is really, invested in promoting equality in education is presenting whatever findings that we have that also speak to boys and their disadvantages in such platforms, because I think, and again, early this year, so we didn't have this paper ready then, but we did allude to the findings to that because we're working on the results still. So I think presenting these findings or any evidence that we have out there intentionally in technical working groups for in educational platforms with policymakers is one key way in which we could do that, so that they could inform, the policies that are being revised or developed in whichever context.
If I could jump in, from your presentation, I got the impression that boys were not really being pushed out by the education system because they were being treated equally within the schools, but they were being pulled out by outside influences, labor market opportunities, drugs, alcohol, things that might be hard for the school system to change.
Yeah, and I don't know where I read this, but there's this term, the feminization of the school environment. So again, going back to my point on guidance and counseling in schools, they're very girl-centered, and so maybe most of the teachers there are not able or very much equipped to tackle the challenges that are unique to boys. So maybe one way of doing that, and maybe I don't know if this is a funder question or something that donors could address, is maybe less feminizing of that school environment. But I was also encouraged by a World Bank report that was released relatively recently, I believe late last year or late 2021, on the underachievement of boys. So that coming from the World Bank was really encouraging, that we should look at boys' disadvantages as well in school. So maybe donors are starting to look at that as a problem.
And how to solve inequality in Brazil.
So from the Brazilian perspective, we have a very structured system, educational system, which the federal government and then state government and then municipal government. So even when we had the BNCC, the National Common Core, the states had to implement the National Common Core and adapt to its context, and then the municipalities were based in this so they could build there. So from my perspective, it's a really difficult question to answer, because there is a very famous, at least in Brazil, study from Madeira that takes blind tests from SAEB and from SARESP, which is a São Paulo test score, standardized test score, that they do in the state of São Paulo, and compares it with the tests that teachers do in class. And when Madeira and co-authors compare these studies, they see that for Black students, they have lower scores when teachers are grading the tests when compared to the same level of the blind test. So with the same score, Black students keep getting lower scores when they are graded by teachers. So the problem is so systemic in our country, so teacher training is something that really is a key piece for developing policies to reduce the racial gaps and also racism in Brazil. But if this is not structured by the secretary, the departments, this will not be able to move, because due to the system in Brazil. So it has to depart from the secretaries so that they can actively engage teachers on this. But this is a very hard topic in Brazil, because the racism is not something that we have it's a blind racism. People don't, sometimes blind, sometimes not so blind, but people don't think, if you ask for Brazilian, there is a opinion survey in Brazilian that they ask, do you think you're racist? And then people say no, but do you think there is racism? And people say yes. So it's a very tricky composition of society, and that's why it has to departure from the secretaries of education, so then teacher can get trained. But so just to wrap up, on our work with this tool that we're developing with this specific municipalities, we are training them an anti-racist training from my consultancy that is a consultancy focused on anti-racism in Brazil. And the people that will apply this tool and will like do this structured survey in the departments will have this training. So I think this is just early beginning of something that could like be much more bigger. So as a public policy in Brazil.
Last round of questions. Sorry.
Can I answer that question
Sorry.
about
Are there some?
teacher versus bug?
Yeah, sure. Is there some online questions?
The one Lindsay asked just now.
Sorry, what?
The one Lindsay had asked.
Oh, yes, sorry. Sorry, Lindsay's question.
Yeah, I wanted to answer that question about teacher versus bug. Sorry, let me take that question, please. I think it's super important to understand that there's many educational technologies, right? And I hope that my study shows that, you know, you just need to be extremely focused on what the technology is doing, right? And you know, when we talk about, you know, putting together, for example, summaries for policymakers, I really hope there is no summary that says EdTech is good or EdTech is bad, right? Because you brought this example with a MOOC. I hope it's very clear a MOOC does something very different than trying to co-teach with a technology in the classroom. Technologies can do many different things. I hope with that study it showed one negative effect. Technologies can do very amazing things when it comes to, for example, personalizing instruction, or if it's well done, increasing the amount that students study after school, right? So I think I hope there's more focus on that and greater appreciation that there are many different technologies, there are many different tools. We have to better understand what they do and in what cases they're positive and what cases they're hurting. So that's what I'm hoping for. That requires nuance, but if there's one thing, I hope that there's great appreciation that there's many technologies. They won't go away, but they can be used in different ways, and I hope there's appreciation for that.
As you noted, the challenges are going to be even greater with AI and, you know, the continued evolution of pressures on school systems to make use of what's out there. But one thing you said in the paper that I thought was interesting is that, you know, these are quote unquote, to some extent, adjustment costs. You know, it's tough for a teacher to change what she's been doing, and it takes time, extra work, et cetera. So it's very good that you're having a long-term follow-up, because one could imagine that once those costs are played out, impacts could be different. Last round of questions, Greg?
I have a question for Laura and a comment for Victoria. How do you deal with self-reported data issues, challenges with race? We've looked at some of the data in Brazil on teachers, and it's between 35 and 50% do not report any race. And in the North, it's closer to 50%. In the South, it's less. So how do you encourage states to think about this? And with Victoria, one thing we just wanted to share at the IDB in Latin America, we have a similar challenge, and a lot of our programs have focused on how do we attract more girls into STEM. And more recently, we've been trying to think about something that you just raised. How do we attract more boys into, you know, early childhood programs or primary schools where still between 70 and 90% of teachers are women? And this may be something that we should think about when we think about these issues.
Any other burning questions? Yes, Jacobus.
Khandekur, I'm just interested if you've looked or thought about mechanisms like fear or self-confidence for in-person. You know, that might be biased downwards, especially for females. You found this interaction with gender, which is really interesting. And Andreas, if you do have time, I'm interested to hear about another comparison to another study that Adrian Lucas and others did in India, where they show that in Pakistan, that showing videos in the classroom actually improved learning outcomes. That might have been more pedagogical in terms of helping, and less of an adoption cost for the teachers to do that. Thank you.
If I could, sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
I just wanted to say, Victoria, thanks. And so much of what you said in Kenya is true in other parts of the world as well. And I just wanted to add that, you know, at least in the classrooms that I spent so much time post-COVID, you know, we've all had this discourse of learning loss, but actually in terms of classroom management, you know, teachers often said the problem was that they came back from COVID knowing too much, and that knowing too much was very much a gendered phenomena, and sort of, you know, linking the two halves of the panel today. A lot of that was because of the gendered access to smartphones. And so, you know, the boys did have much more access to smartphones than the girls did. And they came back knowing too much, which made classrooms much more difficult for teachers to handle. So would love to talk more. Thanks.
If I could just use my prerogative here to ask Waheed one thing. You don't seem to talk about costs much. You know, one clear advantage of mobile technology is you could potentially cover many more students. You know, even if the quality of the assessment is not perfect, maybe the incremental information you gain from a larger population sample might outweigh that. And also what Jacoba said, you know, there may be some distortion from the in-person side too.
Right. Thanks for those questions. Yes, that's possible. And just to position it again, we need to be aware of. So, for instance, when we go to the policymakers, we just did some follow-ups based on this track learning. And when we go to the policymakers want to understand these, like they often want to discount any finding if it is over the phone survey. Oh, this is not something that we do on a regular basis. So this is probably you're distorting somehow. And we just want to know, look, if you understand that as a more conventional measure, this is how the difference is. But again, as I showed at the beginning, there is high correlation. So it's not that someone who is at the other spectrum of learning is doing diametrically opposite between these two modes. It's just how different they are. That's what we are measuring. But of course, the benefit of phone survey is you can do it faster, you can do it cheaper, and with fewer human resources. So both money and time. And based on that question, that's a fantastic point. Unfortunately, because of the length of the survey that we had to impose, we could not measure measure these things which would have allowed us. We would have loved to, but couldn't.
I'm sorry, everyone. We have 40 seconds now to wrap up. I think that the richness of the questions and the richness of the panel goes to my point that these two topics deserve a whole conference on their own. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to our panel.